and welcome Mindsetters to this session of Learn Extra Live, grade 11s. I'm Ty and I'm here with Ilza, who's going to be taking us through today's session. So what are we doing today, Ilza?
Today, Ty, we are doing plant diversity, which I did last week and the week
Alright.
before. But today we're going to focus on the spermatophytes,
Okay.
which is basically the pine tree and the flower plants.
All right. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm excited
Super.
because I'm seeing there's a whole lot of foliage and amazing plant stuff on that side of the room. But anyway, Mindsetters, while Ilza makes her way across, I'm going to tell you that you need by now you know the drill. You guys need to get on the pages www.facebook.com/learn extra. Make sure you guys get your posts in. Let me know what you guys are thinking. If you're lost anywhere, if you need help, make sure you get those posts to me so I can get them to Ilza, who can help you guys out. But on that note, I'm personally very excited because we're doing something a little different today. But on that note, I'm going to hand over to Ilza. Ilza, take it away.
Thanks, Katlego. Today's Ty. Sorry, Ty. Right, guys, we said we're going to look at the spermatophyte plants today, which means that we're going to look at the seeds, how they produce seeds. Remember, we've done the bryophytes, we've done the pteridophytes, we've done moss, all those plants which did not produce seeds. So now we're doing the seed plants. All right. So let's start with this exciting. I know you know plants, you don't like plants, but I love this. All right, so let's start with these two. This is the Angiosperm plant, and this is the Gymnosperm plant. Now, what is the difference? I'm going to do the differences first. Right. The difference is that, or let's start with the actual comparison between the two and say, what are the similarities? I think that's better. Similarities is that they both terrestrial plants, which means that they're adapted for land. They live on land, which means they've got true roots, they've got true stems, as you can see here, leaves, they've got true vascular tissue, which means they have xylem, they have phloem inside these leaves, or veins, proper xylem phloem to transport the food, to transport the water. So they are true terrestrial, which means that they're adapted for land. Now, let's start with the pine tree. Now, if you look at the pine tree, the leaves are very much different to the actual flowering plants. They're needle-like, which means they're long and thin, and they have got a thick cuticle. Now, whenever snows land on these leaves, as we saw all the snow yesterday, the snow will actually fall right through these leaves, which means that these plants can actually grow in very, very cold conditions. They can grow in very, very hot conditions. So the pine tree is very, very well adapted to live in various environments. All right. Now, the cones. These two cones are different. As you can see, this is a female cone, and these are little male cones. Now, these male cones only appear this time of the year. So I was quite lucky to find these male cones on the tree this time of the year. Now, you would say, why are there only male cones this time of the year? Now, as you know, it's a very windy season. So what happens is that these male cones will produce pollen. And this pollen relies on the wind to be distributed. So the wind is going to take this pollen to the female cone where fertilization will take place. So the pine tree relies on wind pollination, whereas the angiosperm plant will rely on insects and wind and water, but mainly insects like bees and flies and so on. All right, now, I'm going to try and do a summary of the fertilization process, okay? So what's going to happen inside these tiny little male cones, as you can see, there's a cluster of them. So one little one, oopsie, all right, inside, we're going to have now the pollen that's going to be produced. So the pollen represents the male sex cell. So if you can see, if I can get that yellow powder. So that yellow powder, that is the actual pollen grains, and inside those little pollen grains are the male gametes or the male sex cells. So what's going to happen as soon as these male cones are ready, it takes about 6 to 8 weeks, these little cones will burst open, releasing millions and millions of tiny little pollen grains, which will now be distributed in the wind. All right? So where's it going to go to? All right, it's going to go on to the other cone, which is the female cone. Now, females are much more complicated, as we know. So we have got different kinds or different stages of female cones. Now, as you can see here, all right, we've got two cones that look similar. They both female cones, but at different stages. So what's going to happen? The pollen is going to go into a smaller female cone where fertilization is going to take place. That little cone is going to grow bigger. It's going to take about 1 year, and then the cone is going to develop into this cone. So this is around about a second-year cone. So what's happening inside this cone now is that the little male pollen grains, or the male cells, are inside this cone. So what's happening inside here is fertilization. Now, once that's happened, it takes about another few months, another year, and then the seeds will form. And then what's going to happen is that these little scales is going to open up. And if you look at this cone now, all right, this is around about a third-year female cone. The scales are open. And what's come out of here are the seeds. And these seeds have got little wings, and they are dispersed in the wind as well. So another feature of these pine trees is that they are dependent on wind, both for pollination as well as for seed dispersal. So that also makes them very much a terrestrial plant and well adapted for terrestrial life. Right, if we look at the actual angiosperm, now what is a big difference between an angio and a gymnosperm is that the seeds of, let's just get this flower maybe, all right? The big difference between these two now is that this is called gymnospermi, all right? So that means that inside are seeds, but those seeds are naked or uncovered. So if you look inside there, right, the seeds is going to lie open, and it's not covered by anything. It's not covered by a fruit. It's not covered by an ovary. So we call this naked or uncovered seeds. All right? Whereas, if you're going to look at the flower, the seeds are produced inside the flower, and we're going to dissect this flower a bit later on, but the seeds are covered by an ovary. So inside there you can see the ovary. Now that ovary is going to develop into this fruit. Yes, and inside the fruit now we have the seeds. So what's an angiosperm plant is that they form flowers, all right, and they form fruit. So the seeds are inside the ovary, inside the seed, and that's known as covered seeds, which is covered by a fruit. So that's one of the biggest differences between the gymno and the angiosperm, is that uncovered seeds in the pine or in the gymnosperm and covered seeds in the angiosperm. All right, so that is the big differences between these two group of plants. Right, we're going to do the detail of the fertilization process, and I think maybe I should, before I get to the detail, just also explain to you about the sporophyte and the, yes, can you remember, the sporophyte and the, yeah, gametophyte generations. All right, so what is the sporophyte generation? Okay, this is the sporophyte generation. And the angiosperm plant, as it's there, that is the sporophyte generation. So they are the dominant generations. The dominant generations. Think about the moss. All right, the moss, we had the gametophyte generation being the dominant generation. Here we have the sporophyte generations being the dominant generations. So what they produce are spores. Now, we're going to look at the detail of that also later on, but they produce inside of these cones little microspores, which will be the pollen grains, and inside there we're also going to have pollen grains, which are the microspores, and the megaspores, which are the female part. So there are spores produced in the sporophytes. Now, where is the gametophyte generation? You can't see it like this. Okay, so the gametophyte generation is right inside inside these cones and inside that little flower. That is where the gametophyte generation is. So sporophyte generations are the dominant generations in this group of plants, and the gametophyte generations have been reduced into inside the little ovules, inside the little pollen grains. So very much so that the sporophyte now is the major and the bigger and the dominant group or part of the life cycle in the alternation of generations. I think it's time for a little ad break, and then we can go on to the detail of each of these group of plants.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Ty.
So on that note, no problem, Ilza. On that note, mindset is, as I keep saying all the time, make sure you get your questions in on the page. If you're lost in it, if you need help, this particular section that you didn't quite understand or you're having trouble with, make sure you get that to me on the page so I can get that to Ilza. But on that note, we'll see you after this break. And welcome back, Mindsetters. Hope you had a nice little break. You went and basically did whatever you had to do to make sure that you're back ready and paying attention. I hope you guys got yourself something warm to drink because it is freezing. As you noticed, it was snowing the other day. I'm not a fan of the cold. But anyway, besides that, I hope you guys are ready. You've got your pens and pads out and you're ready to make notes, and you're going to get posting on the page. So this is the part where I now hand over to Ilse, who's going to continue the rest of the show.
Thank you, Ty. Right, guys, we had a little introduction out to the flowers and to the pine tree. So let's now go into a bit more detail. Right, as we said now, plant diversity, gymnosperms, angiosperms, and we need a pen. Right, those two groups belong to spermatophytes. Okay. Spermatophytes, the word phytes mean plants. The word sperma comes from the word seeds. So these are seed-bearing plants. All right, so both groups produce seeds. Then let's go on to the gymnosperm. We are commonly known as the conifers, okay, because their seeds, as we said, they're seed-producing plants, are produced in cones. There are male and female cones, as I've explained to you. Right. Oopsie, I'm now moving this thing around. Apologize. Okay, has thick waxy cuticle. And we said that is a feature for being able to survive in very harsh conditions. So they adapted for terrestrial or land life. They have a complex vascular system, which means, remember, that they have xylem and phloem, which we did not have in the moss plant. So if you can remember, the moss plant was not adapted for land because it didn't have proper xylem and phloem tissue. Okay, right, they have true root stems and leaves, meaning that this plant is also adapted, as I said, for that terrestrial life. Right. Thing is playing up with me here. Okay, now we're going to get to the life cycle. Now, we have to apply, if you can remember, we did the alternation of generations, and you need to apply that alternation of generations to the moss, to the fern, and also now to the gymno and the angiosperm. So let's see if you can remember anything about the alternation of generations. Let's start with the Sporophyte generation. All right, there's the pine tree now, which is represented now, or representing now the Sporophyte generation. The Sporophyte generation is our 2N, or diploid generation. Meaning that Sporophyte, yes, it's also going to produce spores. Okay, now on this little tree branch here, we can see there's a cone. Now it says ovulate, cone, and that refers to the female. That refers to a female cone, and then the pollen cone is the male cone. Okay, so we have female cones, male cones on the same tree. Now if we go to a bit of detail, if we have to make a longitudinal section, okay, longitudinal sections through a female cone, we're going to notice little round things inside. And those little round things are referred to as megasporangia. Now, I'm doing a very brief summary. You don't need to know all the detail about what happens inside these little megasporangiums, exactly how the egg cells are formed and produced. That detail you're going to do mainly in grade 12 next year. So we're doing very, very briefly the alternation of generations in the pine tree. Okay, so that structure there now, that whole structure, we're now going to call that the ovule. Now that's something different that we didn't have in the moss and the fern. It's called an ovule. Now after fertilization, that ovule is going to develop into the seed. So I'm mentioning it now already so that you can keep that in mind. Right, now what process takes place in the Sporophyte generation? Can you remember? The process of meiosis. Why does meiosis have to take place? Can you remember that? Meiosis needs to take place to make the gametophyte generation. So we're going to have meiosis taking place inside the ovule, and that's going to produce later on the egg cell. Just extend that a little bit more. All right, so meiosis is going to produce inside, going to have the female part, the archegonia, is very reduced now. Remember I said to you the gametophyte generation is very, very reduced in this group of plants. So the sporophyte generation is the dominant generation, and then the gametophyte is reduced. As we can see, the archegonia is reduced there, very small, and inside that we're going to have the egg cells. Okay, let's go back to the male cone. Let's take another color for the male cone. Or maybe not that color. Okay, there's the male cones. Now, they only appear on the tree this time of the year, as I said. That's one male cone. They appear as little clusters, or a little cluster with about 50 little male cones in one cluster. Right, the process of meiosis once again takes place inside these male cones. All right, and these now are all the little pollen grains that I showed you. Those yellow little dots are all the pollen grains. So what's going to happen, they will be now transferred by wind. Okay, now something you have to remember again, from the moss and the fern. What did the moss and the fern depend on for fertilization, for the sperm cell to reach the egg cell? Was water. Now, these plants are not dependent on water for fertilization. They depend mainly on wind for the pollen to get to the female cone. Now, how does the actual little sperm cell get to the female cell? Is by a pollen. Let's just move this up a little bit. All right. So what's going to happen? Yeah. As you can see now, there's a pollen. The pollen gets into there. It shows the pollen grains are going to land now on this. All right. It's going to land there. And these little pollen grains are actually going to grow inside the little egg by using a pollen tube. So instead of water taking the pollen to the female or the male cell to the female cell, there is going to be a little pollen tube that grows into the ovule, taking the male cell into the female cell. And now we're going to have fertilization. What is fertilization? It's N plus N makes 2N. So it's an egg fused with the little sperm cell, and that is going to make now a zygote. All right, so fertilization. We're first going to have a zygote, and then that zygote will develop into the embryo. There you can see it right inside this little embryo. Okay. That is the ovule, which will develop into a seed. That's where the seed plants come in now. So Gymnospermi means seed plants. And where are the seeds? The seeds are now inside the female cone. If we can just go back to that diagram, the longitudinal section of the female cone, there are the ovules. So inside those ovules, that's where fertilization has taken place. And each of those little ovules now is going to produce a seed. So what's going to happen now? That cone, round about the third year, so about 3 years, that's how, 2 to 3 years. That's how long it takes for the female cone to produce its eggs, for fertilization to take place, and for the seeds to be formed. Then this whole male-female cone will open up, and the little seeds have got these wings. All right, so there's little wings, and what's going to happen? They're going to open up, and the seeds will now be dispersed also by wind. These seeds will land on suitable soil, and it will develop into a seedling. All right. And these seedlings have got little cotyledons, which are really the first little leaves, as you can see there. And what's going to happen now, those little leaves can actually photosynthesize, and the whole plant now will grow into the new Sporophyte generation, a new plant. Now, what they love to ask for you to draw a line to show where does the sporophyte and the gametophyte, how are they separated? So where are we going to? We're going to look for two words. We're going to look for the word meiosis, all right, because that is where 2n now becomes n. So the sporophyte generation changes into the haploid generation, which is the gametophyte generation, and we're going to look for the word fertilization. So those are your two words that you're going to look for if you have to draw a line to separate the sporophyte from the gametophyte generation. That's a hint. That's a big hint. Okay, so what you're going to do, take your ruler, and you can now decide how to draw your line. You can draw it straight through like that. All right? And you can say this side is the 2n generation, which is sporophyte generation, and that side is the gametophyte generation. Are you happy with that? Can you remember all of these words that I've mentioned in the previous lessons? I hope so. Let's move on to... Okay, this thing is not the right way. Ty?
Is she misbehaving?
Yeah, this board is definitely misbehaving today.
Are you going to be okay there? Or do you think
I think it's because it's cold.
Yes, it's
I
just...
think it's cold.
Yeah.
Right,
Let me
I think...
see. Are you okay there?
Yes, I'm super.
no
All right,
problem.
thank you. The gymnosperms, there's a range of plants. We said conifers because they form cones. Here's a beautiful picture of, as you can recognize it maybe as a cycad. So there is the cone right in the middle. So cycads belong to this group of gymnosperms. All right, I think before we now going to move on to the angiosperms, Ty, we can maybe then have a tie break. But like I always say, let's have a quick ad break.
All right, no problem. On that note, mindsetters, as I always stress, do not disappear now. Fair enough, go do whatever you have to do. Go answer the phone, go talk to mom, go talk to whoever. But make sure you come back after this break. We'll see you soon. Cheers. And welcome back, Mindsetters. I hope you had a nice little break and made sure that you did whatever you had to do. You went to the bathroom, you went to go get some juice, whatever you had to do to make sure that you're back, ready, and paying attention. So make sure you've got your pens and pads out and you're ready to make notes because we're about to continue with the rest of the show. And this is where Elsa takes it away. Take it
Thank you. Thanks, Ty. All right, guys, like we said, now let's go on to angiosperms and go through a few points of these flowering plants. Okay, they are commonly known as flowering plants, which means now that they form flowers, yes. And when they form flowers, they're going to produce fruit. And inside the fruit, we're going to have seeds. So it's a flowering plant, but a seed-bearing plant because they produce fruit. These are the most advanced plants. They're most advanced in the sense that they've got so many features that make them so successful. Like they have true roots, true stems, they've got seeds. They're well adapted to terrestrial life. They're well adapted to so many different types of environments. So they are the most advanced group of plants. If we started with bacteria, we moved on to protists, we moved on to moss, the fern, and now we're on to the last and the biggest group of plants, the flowering plants. They have varying cuticles, meaning that some cuticles will be thin, some cuticles will be a bit thicker, depending on in which environment they are growing. If you think about the xerophytes, which are the plants growing in the desert, they need a thick cuticle to restore water and to maintain the water inside the plant so they don't dry out quickly. All right. Then, like I said now, they're found in all types of environments. Now, there are three groups from grade 10, if you can remember the three groups. All right, we have got the hydrophytes. The hydrophytes. Okay, now remember the word phytes mean plants. Hydro come from the word water. So these are plants that grow in water. So they can also form flowers. Okay, then we have the mesophytes. Mesophytes are plants that grow on land. They grow on, they're the plants that you find everywhere, except in the water and in the desert. So they are your moderate plants. Okay, then you find the xerophytes. Xerophytes, which are the plants now, as the word xero says, that they need very little water, or they can store their water inside their leaves, inside their stems, so they are known as the plants that grow in the desert. All right, the xerophytes. So those are the three groups of plants that you get living in different environments. These plants have got a complex vascular system, just like we had in the gymnosperm, meaning that they have proper xylem and phloem. Now, being very advanced, these plants can grow very, very big, very, very tall. Think of some oak trees that are huge. These plants need a good support system, which is done by the xylem, and they also need to transport a vast amount of water, which is also the xylem. And they need to transport a lot of food, so they have got a very good system to transport water and food. Right, seeds develop inside the ovary. And that ovary now is going to be inside the fruit. And we're going to say that these seeds are covered. So that's a feature of angiosperms, that they are covered seeds. They're covered inside a fruit, which the ovary is inside the fruit. Okay, so covered inside the ovary, which is developing inside the fruit. Seed plants that produce the reproductive structures are called flowers, as we said, and fruits. So whenever you see a flower plant, you know that it is an angiosperm. Most common examples are lilies, roses. There's a few examples there of two beautiful flowers. There's an orchid, a lovely, lovely flower. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Now, this, you should recognize this from grade 10. This is a comparison between the two groups of angiosperms, the monocot plants and the dicot plants. Okay, monocots and dicots. This is such a good question to ask, and I'm sure you're going to get this question either in grade 11 or in grade 12, where you have to do a comparison between the monocots and the dicots. And a good way of doing that is in a table form. Now remember, you must be able to do a tabulation. So if they ask you to do a tabulation question, you need to draw a proper table. And if you can remember, a proper table consists now of your border lines, your horizontal lines, and your vertical lines. Okay, so this is a tabulation. Right. Let's start with a cotyledon. Now, the word mono means one. One cotyledon, and two. Okay, so two. The word monocotyledon, I think this is the word, monocotyledon. That's a short way for monocotyledon. Now, if you take a seed of a mealy seed and you take a bean seed, I want you to actually go out there and find a mealy seed and find a bean seed. When you take the bean seed, you can break it open into two parts. Those are the two cotyledons. Cotyledons meaning that it's actually food. It's food for the little embryo that grows inside, or that's protected inside the two cotyledons. If you take the mealy pip or the mealy seed, you cannot break it open into two parts. It's only one single cotyledon. Now, when you plant those two seeds, okay, so when you plant the monocotyledon seed, it's going to grow into a monocotyledon plant. When you take a dicot seed, like the bean seed, it's going to grow into a bean seed. Now, as soon as the plants have grown, you can now look at the root systems, you can look at the stems, you can look at the leaves, and you can look at the flowers to distinguish between whether it's a monocot or a dicot flower. Now, let's look at the leaves first of all. Now, I'm sure you can remember this work from grade 10. If you take a leaf and you see a little parallel venation, the leaves, the veins run parallel, that belongs to a monocotyledon plant. When the veins are net-like, so it's got a main vein like that, and lots of little veins that go outwards, that is net venation. Okay? So just by looking at the leaves of a plant. So I would also like you to go outside into your garden, go pick leaves, look at them, parallel venation, net venation. Group them then into monocots and dicots. When you look at the stem, now with the stem you'll have to make cross section. So these are two cross sections. And I'm sure you've done this in your grade 10 year. Okay, so that cross section, what are you going to see? All these little vascular bundles are arranged, scattered. They're not arranged in a specific order. They're scattered everywhere inside the stem. And what do they look like in a dicot stem? You can remember it's done in a little circle or in a ring. So you'll have to make a cross section of the stem to see the vascular bundles inside. What is vascular bundles? Vascular bundles consist of xylem and phloem. Right, then, if you look at the roots, so if you have to pull the plant out the ground and you look at the root system, a fibrous root system, meaning that growing out of the stem are lots of little roots. And that's called a fibrous, or also known as an adventitious root system. Whereas if you look at the angiosperm, they've got a big taproot and all these little lateral roots growing from this main taproot. Now you would say, why is there a big taproot? Now remember, our angiosperm plants are big trees. They need good support. They need good anchor. They need to absorb a lot of water. So they need a very well-developed taproot system. That brings us then to the flowers. Okay, the flowers of the angiosperm and then the pollen grains of the cones. How can we see differences between monocot and dicot? Now, this is a bit of detail, but if you look at the pollen grain, and you have to look under the microscope, there's actually just one little opening in that pollen grain, whereas the pollen of angiosperm it's just subdivided into 3 little parts. And that's all got to do with the pollination process. Because remember now, the wind-pollinated flowers mainly is the pine tree. So they don't need to be so well adapted as those pollen grains of the angiosperm. Okay. Now, if you take the flowers, if you take a flower of the angiosperm, all right, and you look at the dicot, and you look at the monocot, let's just write those 2 words again. Okay, if you look at the flower parts of a monocot is divided into 3s. So you're going to go and count the petals. All the petals will be either in 3s or in 6s. So you go 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is a monocot flower. If you count the floral parts, the petals, and there's 4 or 5s, then you know it's a dicot plant. If you go and look on the inside and you count the number of stamens, and there's 3 or 6s, then you know it's monocot. Or if there's 4 or 5 stamens, then you know it's a dicot flower. So if you dissect flowers, you can actually look at the flower number parts of the different parts of the flower and see whether it's mono or dicot. All right. So please, very, very important is this table that you have to know the differences or the comparison between monocots and dicots. And I want you to apply this to your everyday life so that you can get acquainted with all these terminology words. Right. Now that brings us to this flower. Beautiful angiosperm flower and the different parts. This is a very, very popular diagram, a very popular question that teachers love to ask in exams. So make sure that you can either draw this diagram. They might ask you to draw a longitudinal section of the flower or just the external structure of the flower, label it, give the functions of the flower. Let's start with the bottom part here. All right, we have got a little receptacle. Now, what is a receptacle? That part there. Just a common word for receptacle is a base. You're allowed to use that word base, but please make sure that you know the correct terminology for that. So it's a base of the flower where all the different flower parts are attached to. Then you have got 2, or not 2, you've got more than 2, 4 or 5 of these. Yes, then you'll have a dicot flower. Now, in a monocot flower, these little sepals are absent. So if you see a flower without sepals, then you know it's going to be a monocot. If there are sepals, you know it's going to be a dicot flower. So this is a dicot flower by just looking at that little sepals. Now, in a monocot flower, the sepals have fused together with the rest of the flower parts, with the petals. Okay, what's the function of the sepals? The function is, as you can see, they're green. So, because they're green, yes, they can photosynthesize. All right, they can photosynthesize, but their main function is that, have you ever looked at a rose when it's closed in a bud form? All those little green leaves on the outside, those are the little sepals. So the function of those sepals is then to protect the inside of the flower until the flower is well developed enough, and then these sepals will open up and all the flower parts will be exposed. So the other function of the sepals is then protection. Okay, another term here that you need to know is all the sepals together is known as, I'm going to write it, okay, let's just write it there, is the calyx of the flower. So all the sepals together, the 4 or 5, is called the calyx of the flower. Right, let's get to the beautiful colored part, and that is known as the petal. All the petals together, 4 or 5 in a dicot, 3 or 6 in a monocot flower, then that is the color. Beautiful colored petals. What's the function of that? Is to, yes, attract insects. Insects or birds and bees. Why must these insects be attracted to the flower? Is for pollination. Okay, so what the insect's going to do, they're going to see all these beautiful colors. They don't see like you and I, but they're still attracted to the center of the flower. So all the beautiful nectar is down here, right at the bottom of the flower. So what has to happen is that this little bee has to go right inside the flower, and while it's getting the nectar, what's happening here is that the pollen will get stuck onto all its little hairs, and it's doing the function of pollination. I'll get back to that a bit later on. Okay, so the petals is therefore attracting the insects. All the petals together, if you take all the colored parts, we're going to refer to that as the corolla. Now, all these big words, I'm trying to tell my learners, I'm giving them a few hints so that they can remember these words. And one hint is corolla. You get a corolla car. Corolla cars come in different colors. Or you can remember CC, corolla for color. Just a little hint to remember some of these words. Okay, we're getting to now the male and female reproductive organs inside the flower. Let's start with the male reproductive organs. Right, the male reproductive organs are these little things there. It's a filament, there's another filament, and at the tip of each filament is an anther. All right, so an anther and a filament, collectively known as a stamen, male. I'm going to give you the proper name for this. I think you're going to have to know this for matric. Andrewsium. That's a big word. A way to remember this as well, Andrew. All right, you don't spell it like that, but Andrewsium is just a way to remember it's a boy's name. So that is the male reproductive part of a flower. And what is this anther going to produce is going to be pollen, the pollen grains. And just to give you a bit more information here, by the process of meiosis. Just keep that in mind. All right, so the anther produces pollen grains, and these pollen grains will now be dispersed. How? Now, in flowers, we get different ways of how the pollen is transferred from one flower to the next, either by insects, like bees, I said, wind. If it's a water flowering plant, it will be by water. Now, a lovely question as well, if you look at this flower, they might ask you, is this flower insect pollinated, wind pollinated, water pollinated, or self-pollinated? So some flowers can pollinate itself. Now, if you look at it, it's not self-pollination. Why? Because these anthers, or these filaments, should have been longer. Okay, so if this filament is long, and the anther's there, all right, then the pollen can land on top of the stigma. then it's a self-pollinated flower. So in this case, it will be an insect-pollinated flower. All right, I think we'll come back to the fertilization process after we had an ad break.
All right.
Thank you, Ty.
No problem. So on that note, mindsetters, make sure you do not disappear or run away from the screen. Make sure you come back because we'll be right back after this ad break. See you soon. And welcome back, Mindsetters. I hope you had a nice little break there. And you're ready, you're raring to go. You've got your pens and pads out, and you've been making notes, and you're about to make some more notes. Because yes, grade 11s, I know you guys have a lot of work coming up. So make sure you're making these notes. Very important. But we're going to hand over to Elsa, who's going to continue. Take it away.
Thank you. All right, let's carry on. Right, guys, as I was explaining to you now, where the pollen is produced, the pollen will be dispersed, landing on the female reproductive organ, whether it's by insect, self-pollination, or wind. All right, let's look at the female part now. The female part, it's like a beautiful pink color, consists of 3 parts. First of all, the stigma, the style, and the ovary. That is the female part, stigma, style, and ovary, collectively known as the pistil. I'm going to give you the proper name. It's a gynoecium. A way to remember this, yes, females, gyne, all right, so that's a way to remember the female reproductive organ. Inside the ovary, we have got ovules, okay, and the ovules that's where the egg cell is. So what's going to happen here? The pollen grains are going to land on the stigma. They're going to grow a pollen tube, and the pollen tube is going to go right down, taking the male sex cells right to the ovule, and this is where fertilization is going to take place, is inside those little ovules. And then what's going to happen, briefly explaining to you, is that these ovules will change into seeds. Okay, the whole ovary is going to turn into a fruit. And then all these petals and sepals and stigma and style will fall off because they've done their function. And then what's going to grow out of this flower now is, for an example, an apple or a pear or the fruit that you eat. It can either be edible fruit or dry fruit like a bean or a pea pod. Okay, so you're actually then looking at, when you eat fruit, you're looking at the ovary that was inside the flower of the plant. Okay? Right, I need to go through this alternation of generations. Now, we've done alternation of generations, so I'm going to do this quite quickly. Sporophyte generation, that is the flower. Anthers, that is where the microspores and the pollen grains. Okay, so microspores inside the pollen grain, very much the same word. They land on the stigma. A pollen tube will grow down, as we said now. Okay, all right, so we're going to have then the pollen tube that grows down. Okay, so we have meiosis as well, producing the egg cell. Okay, so we're going to have that. All right, so now we have the pollen tube. The pollen tube now is going to grow right into the female ovule. We're going to have fertilization taking place. Okay, after fertilization, we're going to have a zygote. That zygote is going to develop into an embryo, which is inside the seed, and that seed is going to germinate, producing the sporophyte generation. So now, where do we have now the line that we have to draw? As I said, meiosis and fertilization. So there we have the sporophyte generation, which is 2N, or diploid generation, that side. And this side, we have got the haploid generation, which consists of the egg and the sperm cell. All right, so the two fuse together, and it forms the new 2N generation. Make sure that you know this alternation of generation and that you apply it to all the different plants that we have done and learn it very, very well. Okay, that now brings us to a summary of all the plant groups that we have done. This is the way to go now, grade 11. So once you've studied from your bacteria, your mosses, the ferns, Gymnosperm, Angiosperm, go and make yourself a big table to compare. What we've got here is a comparison between the bryophytes, all right, the bryophytes, the pteridophytes, the Gymnosperms, and the Angiosperms. So those are our 4 main plant groups. Those are the features. Okay, these bryophytes, as you can remember, small plants, they were called a thallus. No true root, stems, and leaves. The ferns did have large leaves, they did have roots, they also had stems underground. Can you remember the word rhizome? Underground. Okay. All right, Gymno Angiosperms, they've got true leaves, true roots, vascular tissue, none in the moss, xylem and phloem, xylem and phloem, xylem and phloem. In these ferns, Gymno and Angiosperm. Fertilization, moss depends on water. Remember that? Ferns depend on water. These two, independent on water. They had pollen tubes that took the male cells to the female cells. Seeds or spores, spores in the moss, spores in the ferns, seeds that are not enclosed, and seeds that are enclosed in the seed-bearing. So these are seed-bearing plants. Okay, so this is a very, very important table, and it's a summary of all the plants that you have done. So I would suggest, like I said now to you, to make a comparison, make your own table. You can even add little pictures. I believe that if you study with pictures, so you can add a little picture of the bryophyte. So I would go and I would draw a little moss plant there. All right. I will go now draw a fern plant. You remember all the little leaves on a fern plant. I will take a gymnosperm. I'll draw, for example, the 2 cones. Okay, there's the male and a female cone, and then I'll go and draw a beautiful flower with all its petals. So pictures tells the whole story of more than words can tell. So make yourself a whole table, add in a column for pictures. Okay, and then you can also add in maybe the alternation of generations, which is the detail of these plants. Okay, grade 11s, I'm telling you good luck with this section on plant diversity, and hopefully by next week I'm back to do the animal diversity. So good luck for your test if you're writing one soon. Thank you. Thanks, Ty.
Okay, no problem. Mindsetters, thank you so much for getting your questions in. And I know, we wanted to get through as many questions as we could, but unfortunately there's so much content, so we weren't able to get through all of them. But doesn't mean you stop posting. Mindsetters, do not forget, you always need to help each other out. So if you do see another mindsetter in trouble, make sure you help them out if you know the answer. Because as we said, we won't be able to get through all of them. But on that note, Mindsetters, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today and for posting on the page. And I want to thank Ilse for that. And on top of that, Mindsetters, we're going to see you next time. Cheers.